Okay, in part 3, I want to tell you a little bit more about using R to draw a random sample and then talk about some possible specific types of bias to keep an eye out for. So first, let's go ahead and take a look at how we could do this if we had a data frame in R. And one of the exercises will ask you to do this. So the data frame that we're going to be looking at is the student survey. And we just want to get a sample of size 3, just a very small sample from the student survey. So for space limitations, I'm just giving the first few columns, but I'm going to go ahead and run these commands over in our Studio. So we've already done the first two though, so we can just sample the student survey. So I'm going to go over here, but first I'm going to say head of student survey. And notice that it prompts me for autocomplete, and I can see quite a few cases here. Another command that's sometimes useful if you want to see what's going on with the data set is glimpse. And that gives us a quick list of all the variables and a few sample values. That is a few typical values. That is the first few values for each variable. All right, so now the thing though that we're interested in is to sample from, what was it? To sample from the student survey and to get a sample of size 3. Student survey, let's do 10 instead of 3. And those are the first 10 observations. We could try to move this over to see if it will use a little bit more real estate, and it actually does fit it in. So that might be a little bit easier to see. So these are our first 10 observations, and that would be a random sample. Simple random sample. It's not sorted, right? So you can see the case numbers jump all around, and it's just a simple random sample. So that's a great way, great technique for using the sample function to generate a random sample from an R data set. All right, so let's take a look then back at types of bias. I said there were a few types of bias, and here are a few that I identify as common sources of kinds of bias. The first one, and remember, bias was a systematic error. The idea of bias is it's somehow the method of collecting data causes the sample to inaccurately reflect the population. So one is undercoverage. So right now there's certainly a lot of concern about the pandemic. If you did a web-based survey, you would be missing some groups of the population. Undercoverage is a kind of bias when some groups of the population are omitted from the process of choosing the sample. So if those that are not included in the sample, that is ones who don't have access to the web or are not going to a particular website, then if their attitudes differ from the general population, then there will be bias as a result. Now we have the next two are commonly confused, non-response and response bias. Non-response bias is the idea of where some individuals can't be contacted, refuse to participate. You can imagine how those might also occur in perhaps ecological settings, or not that they couldn't be contacted, but some are more easily found than others perhaps. If they're somehow different, say maybe more active, less active, then there could be bias trying to generalize from those that can be contacted or found more easily. Response bias is different, and that's easiest to think about when we're thinking about perhaps a survey where we're trying to get attitudes. Could be a public health survey, and so the behavior of the respondent or the interviewer causes bias. So it could go either way. The interviewer might, let's say, just to give an extreme example, you're doing a survey of about attitudes toward vaping on campus, and of course, if the interviewer happened to be vaping at the time or have some equipment nearby, that might influence the type of responses, or perhaps an interviewer that was smoking or in some way, exhibiting behavior that would cause people to respond in a more appropriate, sort of socially acceptable way. The behavior of the respondent, probably the most common thing that I've seen there is not so much behavior, but just maybe a memory issue where people tend to remember incorrectly, underestimate or overestimate maybe how often they engage in a particular activity, or just then trying to remember what their responses should be. If it's alcohol use, they may not have clear recall on how much they drank or how often they drank. Wording bias is the last one, and I just wanted to show you one example of an interesting study about wording bias, and it's a difficult issue, so I don't want to diminish that. It's attitudes toward assisted dying and how they're influenced by question wording and order. So I have a link for that. I believe I have my copy open here, but you can get a link here. So let me just take you through a little bit of this. Because I want to give you some substance. Some of these ideas are perhaps familiar or not that difficult, but this is a Norwegian study. And given my last name, one might think that I have a particular interest here. Unfortunately, I speak no Norwegian, or maybe a word or two. But this is attitudes towards assisted dying are influenced by question wording and order. So this was a survey of attitudes about assisted dying, as it's described here. The method that was used was a survey experiment, which an 8-question survey on attitudes toward assisted dying was distributed to Norwegian citizens through a web-based panel. 2 variations of question wording, as well as 2 variations of question order, were employed. Respondents were randomized to receive one of 4 questionnaire versions. So I'm going to just show you a couple things in here that I thought were particularly interesting. One is in their background section. They talk about some other studies that have been conducted, and they talk about order effects, wording effects versus context effects. I'm really just going to focus on wording effects. Answers are influenced by the precise wording of the attitude question. For instance, in specific terms may give rise to particular interpretations or evoke particular association and feelings in the respondent. Historically, questions about gun control or abortion have been quite sensitive, and responses related to how the question was worded. In this case, it's a study in which they asked about physician-assisted dying. 23% of the public agreed that, this example wasn't about that. It was about welfare and assistance to the poor. So 23% of the public agreed that too little was being spent on welfare, whereas 64% agreed that too little was being spent on assistance to the poor. So depending on how this is phrased, the term welfare seemed to evoke more negative opinions and affected the responses. Context effects sort of involves how the question is asked with a larger context. A Canadian study, 991 respondents from the general population were asked to take a stand on euthanasia based on 2 different descriptions of the act, none of which used the term euthanasia. The first question portrayed euthanasia in a more positive light by emphasizing the patient's short life expectancy and great suffering. Here, 80.8% agreed that the doctor should, quote, should be allowed by law to end the patient's life through mercy killing. Available alternatives were yes, no, and don't know. The second question presented both the act and the circumstance in a less positive way, in response to which 69.6% found it completely or somewhat acceptable that the doctor would give an injection which causes death. So depending on the response that was perhaps desired by the researchers, it might affect how the question was asked. Australian study, they asked, do you support the idea of euthanasia, or do you believe that a doctor should be able to assist a patient to die? So there are a couple different ways in which this is asked. Let's see, also they asked, do you believe that a doctor should be able to deliberately bring about a patient's death? So depending on how the question is phrased, these first 2 are quite similar in terms of the response. The Norwegian study, you can take a look at the details. Here's a little bit of a summary of the basic essence of it, the questionnaire versions, what I wanted to call your attention to is just that this table 4 shows that the way in which the question was asked certainly results in different kinds of responses. Different levels of positivity, I guess. And then by subgroup, of course, there are differences in attitudes toward assisted death, physician-assisted death. All right, so I wanted to give you one concrete example of this wording bias because it can be so prevalent and something that's related to what I would say is the field of biostatistics. So, to get back, I think we've pretty much got to the end. A question that I often ask at this point is, do you love statistics? And I ask you, if we were in a class, I could ask for everyone who loves statistics to raise their hand, and you might take that as an exercise then to identify all the forms of undercoverage that you would find if we were trying to make generalization to all college students, and whether or not they love statistics. So I'll let you work on that on your own, to think through what forms of bias might you find, and feel free to drop me a note and see what you found in terms of bias and asking that way. All right, I think we'll wind it up here. Gone on long enough. So good luck with section 1.2, and thank you for listening.